Welcome back to Chapter 28, Part 2, Surrealism. The Surrealist Manifesto was written by André Breton in 1924. He describes Surrealism as pure automatism, by which it is intended to express either verbally or in writing or in any other way the true functioning of thought. The absence of any control exerted by reason and outside all moral and aesthetic consideration. So the ideas behind surrealism is to explore the subconscious. This is really based on the ideas of Sigmund Freud. So you see a lot of dreamlike images. You also see a lot of ideas of the subconscious, of things that you might not be aware of. Therefore, surrealists were doing a lot of things like sleep deprivation. You don't know anything about that. Sleep deprivation for days on end, and then creating work, things like this to try to get to that subconscious mind. A game that the surrealists would often play, which typically, again, I do in class. I haven't figured out how to do this yet, so we might. Is the Exquisite Corpse. This is a game where one person draws something on a piece of paper. You fold it so only the last little bit is showing, and then someone else starts drawing. And you do that, and you continue drawing, so you don't actually see what the other people have done before, and then you reveal it at the very end. It's quite interesting. Pablo Picasso, Three Dancers. So we have this image of these three figures. Now you can see that Pablo is still working in a cubist mindset. You can see that in the woman's face here. So you have part of the face from one angle, then you can obviously see that her eye is from a different angle here. Same with her breast, so you have one straight on, one to the side. So you have these different angles at the same time. So the central figure here is almost a crucified form. So the central dancer has her arms up and outstretched. You've got the figures on each side of her. But again, that cubist perspective of front and side, different angles all at the same time, makes it very disorienting. You also have this kind of stars on the wallpaper here. This is the Three Musicians. This is kind of a fun piece that Pablo Picasso did. First of all, there is a dog under the table, so you can see there's his body, there's his tail. His head is actually over here. I know it's very difficult to see. And then we have the three different musicians, and they seem to be in very different outfits. So the central figure almost seems to be in a commedia dell'arte costume, while the figure over here almost seems to be in a monk's robe. So we have these different costumes here. Again, we've got this cubist idea. Pablo Picasso actually never considered himself a surrealist, but Breton saw cubism as a first step towards loosening the grip on reality and therefore opening your mind up to these new things. Also, you notice that the woodwind performer here almost seems to be mimicking Henry Rousseau's The Snake Charmer in The Dream. And this is a 3D piece of Pablo Picasso's called Head of a Woman. Again, it's made out of random pieces put together. So we've got this almost colander shape here and other pieces of metal that have been welded together and then all painted white. André Maison. This is an example of one of his automatic drawings. He started doing these in 1924. He made a series of them. And what he would do is he would get into this almost trance-like state and then start drawing. And then sometimes he would just randomly squirt glue on it. That's what the sand is adhered to here. So we can see all the sand that's been attached through some white glue that's been squirted on there. Again, the idea is to get to the subconscious. You can see some things that are recognizable here, kind of organic forms, fish, might be other kind of creatures here. Very much a natural feel to it. This is Max Ernst, La Toilette de la Marie, or Retirement of the Bride. In Canvas, you'll actually see a couple of videos of Max Ernst performing some of his art, specifically his frottage and grattage techniques. These are ones that he developed on his own. So frottage is rubbing graphite or crayon or charcoal over paper placed on an object. Oftentimes you would use floorboards, chair caning, flowers, and then you would utilize that surface into your work. So you'll notice that Max's work, he tends to have this very fantastical element to it. We've got these kind of creatures, this part man, part bird, same with the woman here. So we have these elements that are slightly recognizable but not quite. He also developed a technique called decalcomania, which is a very similar technique. It's using pressure and diluted oil paint on canvas to transfer, again, a surface texture. He's done this here with the robe right here. Here's another one that Max has done. This one has used the grattage technique in order to create this temple building here. So again, he would use the canvas dried paint in order to create this kind of almost a Mayan looking structure. Leonora Carrington was one of the few female artists that was officially part of the Surrealist movement. Andre Breton was very much a sexist, and so he limited the number of women who he considered to be surrealists and really limited their influence. However, she actually was able to gain some notoriety at the time. She was also the lover of Max Ernst up into World War II, at which point they were living in France, but Max being German, he was actually arrested on several occasions and put into jail. She ended up, because of all of the stress of the war happening and him constantly either arrested or being under house arrest, she ended up having a mental breakdown, and her father secreted her away into Spain, where she ended up in a sane asylum, ended up having electroshock therapy, which she writes about, really crazy things, and then she ends up marrying a Mexican diplomat, being able to escape to Mexico, and then that marriage quickly dissolves thereafter. She has an absolutely crazy, insane life, but she has some amazing works. And because I did my master's thesis on her, you get to learn about her. So her dates are 1917 to 2011. So she lived a very long time. She was also ambidextrous. She painted with both hands, which is kind of interesting. So this is an early work of hers, of Max, as you can see. The horse is a symbol she uses throughout her work, oftentimes represents herself. This is Self-Portrait, or Inn of the Dawn House. This is considered to be her earliest work. And so she was 20 at the time. Again, that's a self-portrait of her. There's a hyena. She has a short story that includes a hyena in it. And again, the horse is very important. That's because she grew up in England with several horses, going out riding. This was a very big part of her life. Why art thou white-faced? So this actually has some Adam and Eve in the garden symbolism here with the snake and the person and the fruit, as well as some Celtic imagery, and then fertility with the egg. There's a lot of symbolism in her work. You have these fantastical creatures that are very delicately painted. Here's one that she did called the Giantess. She painted this when she was heavily pregnant. She says she felt like a giant, like many pregnant women feel. You can see that in this piece. You can see that she's incorporated a lot of sea creatures here behind, lots of nature and animals surrounding. She does a lot with fertility, so there's lots of eggs and things like that. Good King Dagobert, that actually talks about an actual, I believe it's an Irish king. She's well versed in the Celtic mythology. This is the Tuatha De Danann, that was the mythical first race of the Celts. And so she's painted them almost like what we now consider to be stereotypical now aliens. So kind of interesting, these beings of light. She does a lot with these, what are now considered to be kind of these areas of the women. So lots dealing with cooking and eating and food, along with, again, the eggs and fertility. This is Mundo Mágico de los Mayas. So after she moved to Mexico, she started adopting a lot of the indigenous mythologies there in Mexico. And you can see that with Quetzalcoatl, the snake here, and a lot of the other symbolism, as well as we have this kind of Baroque church here, tree of life, lots of different symbols. This is a giant mural that she did. Here's the jaguar head. And here is a photograph I thought was interesting. So these are a lot of the important surrealists and other important people at this time. This is from the Artists in Exile show, 1942. So we have Max Ernst here. This is Leonora Carrington. We've got everyone from Marcel Duchamp, Piet Mondrian, big names in here, including Peggy Guggenheim. Top row here, there's Peggy. She actually ended up getting Max out of Europe, and she was able to produce some shows for him here in the U.S. and New York. She was also the one to actually produce Leonora's first show in New York as well. Peggy Guggenheim was, again, another fascinating individual, and she ended up furthering the careers of a lot of these artists. And you can see Andre Breton in his position there in the center. To continue on with some other surrealist artists, this is Juan Miró. This is composition. He is a Catalan from Barcelona, just like Gaudí. He came to Paris in 1920. His studio was next to Maison. Miró actually studied Cubism first. He began painting from his imagination. He also experimented with different ways of bringing on the unconscious, including these bouts with hallucinations brought on by starvation. So he would starve himself until he started hallucinating and then start painting. We have these very abstract biomorphic and geometric forms, as you can see. There seems to be faces on some of these, but there otherwise doesn't seem to be much bodies, and many of the things seem to be almost blob-like, but we do have these kind of faces kind of emerging. We also have a minimal color field in the background. So in 1933 is whenever he started becoming more and more abstract, and he started being very interested in the more abstract and getting farther and farther away from anything that you could identify. So in this, we have a nice little mix of things you can identify, like the faces, or maybe even like this ball here. There's a lot of these kind of bulbous forms that don't really suggest anyone or anything. René Magritte, this is the false mirror. He's from Brussels. Breton actually never officially recognized him as a surrealist. Breton is a very prickly individual. By the way, I do not recommend reading his Surrealist Manifesto. It's unless you're really suffering from insomnia, in which case you might. In 1928, he creates The False Mirror, and he's again very much interested in the unconscious mind, and the idea here is that the eye is this doorway into the unconscious. So you have this close-up of the eye, which the iris is transformed into eclipsed sun, and then we have surrounding it sky. Salvador Dali and Louis Bundel. This is a still from the film Andalusian Dog. As I said, this is on canvas as well as linked in the YouTube under the playlist. It's fairly short. I think it's like 20 minutes. I encourage you to watch it. It has a very famous scene where the eyeball is being cut. Don't worry, it's not a human eyeball. It's actually a pig's eyeball that they use. But whenever you think about it, that this is happening in 1929, and look at all of the things that they're trying to do. Now, we might think, oh, the special effects are horrible. But again, this is the very beginning of cinema. So really kind of consider that when you're looking at this and what they're attempting. This is, again, fascinating piece. Dealing with the unconscious, the dreams, very much stream of consciousness, dreamlike. And of course, Salvador Dali's famous The Persistence of Memory. So again, Salvador Dali, he was very much, first of all, a showman. He liked to perform. He himself had, of course, the mustache. He liked to also try to induce these various altered states in which to paint. So he would create this almost frenzied, paranoid state to begin painting. We have this head. We have these melting clocks that he actually said that he was influenced by some camembert cheese that had been sitting out, and so it had started to kind of melt, and that's what actually his influence was for that. We have this pocket watch here that has the ants crawling on it, and so the ants actually have to do with decay. In fact, this whole piece really does, if you look, because we don't have anything other than the ants that are living. Everything is dead. Look at the background. We have this actually beautiful background of cliffs and water, but there's no birds, there's no clouds, there's no trees, there's no people, there's no animals, except for, again, those ants and the fly that's right here. Again, fly, ants. These are creatures that are kind of associated with death and decay. So we don't have, a green budding tree here. We don't have the birds in the sky. It's very desolate. Here's a couple of other pieces of Salvador Dali's I thought you might be interested in. He was raised Catholic, and so a lot of his pieces have to do with his religion. And of course, you have to have his mustache. He grew that out specifically to be a talking point. That became part of his persona. Henri Cartier-Bresson, behind the Gare Saint-Lazare. Cartier-Bresson, he was French. He tries to capture a moment in time. That's really what he's trying to do. We have an action moment. We have a man running through the image here. So we actually see a little bit of the pools of water, and we see him as a blur. We really have a sense of maybe a supernatural magic, where we have the man as kind of silhouetted in mid-air. Cartier-Bresson trained as a painter, but started doing photography in the 1930s. Man Ray, The Gift. He created this in 1921 as a gift for composer Erik Satie. There are tacks that are glued onto the flat side of an iron. So, in the most basic realm, this is taking a useful object and rendering it useless. Obviously, you cannot iron. It is going to be ripping holes in your clothing. So that's the most basic. There are interpretations that because this is a object that is used in the women's realm, this point in time, this is definitely considered to be kind of women's work, in quotes, in the 1920s, at this, the ironing. And then we put these tacks, these kind of painful aspects to it. So there's this innuendo of maybe violence. Again, that's impossible interpretation. Merritt Oppenheim, object, or luncheon in fur. Merritt was the daughter of a Jungian psychologist. Carl Jung is a well-known psychologist, very much interested in the same things as Sigmund Freud. She was also Man Ray's model and assistant, and this is a teacup, a saucer, a spoon that she has covered all with gazelle fur. She actually named it Object. It was Andre Breton who renamed it Luncheon in Fur. He thought that was a funny play on Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. So again, you have rendered these very useful utilitarian objects utterly useless. Alexander Calder. This is Lobster Trap and Fishtail. He was born in Philadelphia. He moved to Paris in 1926. He didn't start making mobiles until the 1930s. These are painted sheet metal that have been attached to metal wires, and they're hinged together to be perfectly balanced. So even the slightest gust of air will make it move or tilt or glide or chime, depending on what he wants. So it's really the balance in these pieces that's I think the most important. His pieces can be rather large. They can be up to 30 feet in span there, so they can be quite large. So in this one, the title actually tells us what we're looking at. So we've got a lobster trap, and then we've got a school of fish here. Obviously, these are all kind of abstracted into these shapes. But again, these are kind of just gently gliding, spinning in the air, just like they would be floating in the water. He tends to use these very primary colors. So in this one, we basically have black and red, and you consider white a color here. I thought you might enjoy looking at these. These are actually a whole series Calder did of portraits. Again, he used wire. These are not necessarily hung. Some of them are, as you can see, but some of them aren't. And he would just take one, sometimes 2 or 3 pieces of wire and very simply create these portraits of individuals just with these simple wires. And they're really quite fascinating. Some are meant so that you're actually looking more at the shadow. Some you're meant to actually look directly on. Henry Moore, recumbent figure. Henry studied at the Royal College of Art in London in 1921. This figure from 1938 is supposed to be a reclining river goddess based on pre-Columbian figures. So the whole figure is supposed to be very elemental, universal. So we have this very simplistic form of a female figure. We know it's female because of the breast, but that's it. Other than that, it's just a humanoid figure. But you also notice that the material he's chosen is this very brown, earthy stone. So it's meant that this figure is supposed to mirror the earth, more of an earth goddess figure, mirroring maybe the mountains, the way that the leg and the knee is here. So you have the sense of maybe it's supposed to be almost a mountain range. You'll also notice that very well composed with the solid and the voids being both kind of balanced with this figure. This is Barbara Hepworth, sculpture with color, deep blue and red. There's a lot with abstract forms. We've got lots of very geometric forms, though there are some organic forms in her work as well. A lot of pieces kind of like this have kind of an egg-like quality.